everybody. Good to see everybody. Delighted to be here and delighted and congratulations to you folks for making the top 12. It's a big deal, so feel good about it here. So we'll introduce ourselves, then have you introduce yourselves, and we'll get started. Oh, must have had a good break. My name is Thomas Mackey. I'm in the history department at the University of Louisville and with the law school here at the University of Louisville.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Taubman. I'm a senior judge on the Colorado Court of Appeals in Denver, Colorado.
I'm Lindsay Draper. I'm Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion of the Institute for Wellbeing in Law.
Cool. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves and your teacher if you wish.
Of course. Salutations. We're Irvington High School's Unit 2. I'm Ryan Fang.
I'm Frederick Xiong.
I'm Geetika Yelagoti, and we'd like to thank the judges and facilitator, as well as our coach, Mr. Martinez.
Cool. We're going to work on question 1 here this afternoon. And question 1 reads as follows. What were the major disagreements among the 55 delegates during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and how were they resolved? What issues, if any, were not resolved, and what were the consequences? What changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution? You may begin.
Addressing the Constitutional Convention delegates, Benjamin Franklin said both sides must part with some of their demands in order that they may join in some accommodating proposition. The convention's compromises over the issues of representation, term limits, and the electoral process laid the foundations of our government today.
Among the most divisive issues was representation. Larger states backed James Madison's Virginia plan, while smaller states rallied behind William Patterson's New Jersey plan. Eventually, the Grand Committee brokered the Great Compromise, which created a bicameral system that would have a proportionally represented lower house and an equally represented upper house.
Slave representation was another contentious issue. Since Southerners were to be taxed for owning slaves, they wanted slaves to count towards representation. Northerners objected since slaves had no say in the selection of representatives. Both sides were eventually appeased by the 3/5 compromise.
The delegates also disagreed on term lengths for the presidential position. A majority favored a single 7-year term, but both Madison and Wilson objected, believing that such a term was too long and powerful. The Committee of Postponed Matters ultimately shortened the 7-year term to 4 years, but allowed presidents to run for re-election.
The means of electing the president were also a matter of debate. James Wilson called for a direct popular vote, while Roger Sherman called for Congress to elect the president. Though it garnered little support upon introduction, in the end, the Electoral College was chosen as a compromise between the two by the Committee of Detail.
Despite the compromises that were made, however, the delegates left many issues unresolved. Chief amongst them, citizenship, state sovereignty, and judicial power. Though both Federalists and Anti-Federalists agreed on the importance of the issue, citizenship was never truly resolved. Federalist 42 argued for a uniform process since it would stabilize the Union, but Federal Farmer 18 disagreed, since such a process would intrude on state sovereignty. Because the matter was left unresolved, the process was left ultimately to the states until the Civil War amendments, leading to a fully nationalized process of obtaining U.S. citizenship.
Another issue was the system of federalism created. Questions regarding the extent of federal power and state sovereignty have remained a persistent issue throughout American history. They led to the first and second party systems, played a major part in the Civil War, and have maintained an adversarial two-party system to this day.
Finally, the framers never fully finished the judiciary. Though the Supreme Court was established and given the power of judicial review, Article 3 did not define finer details of the court's powers and scope. As a result, the Supreme Court was forced to define its own powers and restrictions through the cases brought to it, resulting in its expansive power to determine the constitutionality of law today. Anti-Federalists such as Brutus viewed this lack of detail as a flaw, since the court appeared in Brutus 15 independent of the people, of the legislature, and of every power under heaven.
Though the time of the framing has long passed, no institution is perfect. We believe that in order to further expand democracy, the Constitution should be changed to abolish the Electoral College and institute judiciary term limits.
The Electoral College dilutes the votes of citizens in larger states. Since states are guaranteed at least 3 electors each, regardless of size, smaller states that make up only 4% of the total population are given 8% of Electoral College votes. Thus, the Electoral College should be abolished in favor of the direct popular vote.
Due to the nature of Supreme Court appointments, the institution has become increasingly unresponsive to public views in recent years, as justices are allowed to remain on the courts decades after appointment. The implementation of staggered term limits would create a regular appointment process, allowing the court to become a more democratic body able to reflect the will of the people today. Thank you, and we're ready for any questions you may have now.
Okay, thank you. Interesting, a lot to grab hold of there. Let me go sort of start with you where you ended and ask you about the issue that the 18th century dealt with that you've been dealing with or thinking about, and that is judicial independence. Do you really how would judicial term limits further or limit judicial independence? And is judicial independence worth preserving?
In Federalist 78, Hamilton expounds upon the importance of the judiciary remaining independent because it possesses neither the sword nor the purse. It only possesses judgment, and as a result, it should be independent because it is the weakest of the 3 branches. I believe that it's worth preserving, and staggered term limits would have a hand in preserving the court's independence, as it would create a regular appointment process. In doing so, it would prevent the court from being tied to older presidential administrations through appointments decades ago.
Furthermore, SCOTUS has an obligation to be responsive to the will of the people because the judiciary is elected by the justices on the Supreme Court are appointed by elected representatives and elected presidents. So with the staggered term limits that we propose, we would see that there's consistency in the appointment process so that the justices are elected in response to the political views of the people that elected their representatives and presidents.
I'd like to explore that further with you. Why do you believe that judges should be responsive to the will of the people? A lot of times judges decide issues that may be politically unpopular in favor of minorities. There are all kinds of decisions that we could cite, like Brown versus the Board of Education, flag burning cases, et cetera. So why should judges be responsive to the will of the people?
To that extent, we have to look at Federalist 78. I believe, Hamilton basically discusses how the judiciary should be acted as a guard against the passion of the moment. However, in today's society, we have to take into context modern political issues and how they may affect the greater good rather than simply the law itself. And so term limits allows for the judiciary to be more responsive to such greater good impacts.
Constitution scholar Paul Freund was once known for a quote, "It's that the court should enforce not the weather of the day, but the climate of the era." In the modern era and in the 20th century, where civil rights legislation and the civil rights movement has become an increasingly popular movement back then in history, the court was obligated to follow not the passion of the day, which supported racism and segregation, but rather the climate of the era, which moved towards more civil rights for more people and more minorities.
Haven't we in fact relied on the court to help persuade us and educate us as a people as to where the law ought to go? That the court has led the ideas and not necessarily been stuck with people. And I guess I want to continue on this point with you and would point to a whole bunch of people in the South who believed that segregation was appropriate, and a whole bunch of people who believed that marriage between a man and a woman was what God intended, but the court helped persuade people to change their mind, aren't you exactly presenting the opposite of what has happened?
I think one of the checks on the court is that the president has to help enforce the court's decision. So for example, when we look at Brown v. Board of Education, the president sent the National Guard to enforce that decision. So it's not just the Supreme Court that rules on these rules on these decisions, but it's also the way that the other branches of the government enforce the decision.
But I guess the
Furthermore-
point that I'm trying to make is exactly what you just said, that had the court not done something, there would not have been a need for the president to take action. The court led the way and was safe to do it because they weren't dependent on what the public thought.
Yes, Hamilton explores, again, in Federalist 78, about how the court, again, not having neither the sword nor the purse, has only judgment and therefore must direct the sword and the purse in appropriate means. And as a result, seeing the judiciary seeing the Supreme Court rather than the judiciary, but the Supreme Court lead this sort of new era into prominence is not exactly uncommon, although there do exist checks should the decision be severely unpopular rather than unpopular with a single group or a demographic.
Okay, thank you.
Interesting. Let me then sort of circle back to the Federal Convention and touch on one of the big issues. You've touched on representation, but they spent almost as much time worrying about that executive, about how to choose them, and in particular, that proto-executive in the Constitution worried the Anti-Federalists a great deal. We live in an era of the cult of the presidency, so were the Anti-Federalists right that the presidency turns out to be, in the long run, a major problem?
I would argue that while the Anti-Federalists were right about how the extent to which the president's power would expand, such as in Cato 4, they talk about how the president's war power, the president's appointment power, the president's things like that. In Cato 4, they explore these possibilities of the president gaining power as time goes on. And yes, we have seen that today with the rise of the modern presidency. However, I don't think that's become an issue because as the presidency has expanded, it's expanded in response to national emergencies such as wars or things such as the Great Depression.
I like to disagree with my colleague there. Cato 4 does talk about the executive as a proto-monarch. However, if you look at Federalist 70, Hamilton really talks about how the executive differs from the monarch. But the thing is, in today's society, the unitary government executive theory has essentially entrenched the executive into a state of monarchy, whereby the president acts almost as a solitary executive with little to keep him in check. And so the Anti-Federalist in this case, I believe, is correct.
I'd also like to go back to the convention and ask you what the framers' views were about commerce. Did the
So during
framers
the-
have a view about export tariffs and import tariffs?
Yes. Well, the Commerce Clause in the Constitution exists, and looking back at it, Madison's Virginia Plan also encouraged Congress to support interstate commerce. The Articles of Confederation were not known for being able to regulate interstate commerce, and that came up as an issue of contention. However, the majority of framers agreed that interstate commerce was a power that the national legislature should have control over.
So I'm just a little curious as to whether you believe the constitutions addressing Indians and treaties and the way that that was done created additional problems that had to be resolved later in our country's history. Viewing them as a separate nation as opposed to people with access to citizenship.
I believe that the Constitution, being that it treated Native Americans as a separate entity in terms of legality rather than simply residents of the land, did create significant problems. In fact, one could argue that the Trail of Tears is a direct result of the Constitution enforcing the dogma that the Seminoles, as well as other Indians, are not residents, but rather aliens partaking in the lands of the United States.
Furthermore, to make up for that reparation, the United States has been forced to come up with multiple legislations. For example, the Dawes Act in the 1900s, right? Things such as that have been used by America in order to sort of make up for repatriation or perhaps to integrate them into today. But as a result, it has left a historical scar on our nation's history.
We see some of the repercussions of this in the modern era, where there are indigenous people in North Dakota disenfranchised because of voter ID laws, state voter ID laws that require specific addresses that Native Americans that live on reservations don't necessarily have.
Okay, sorry to cut you off, but that's time. This is just always an evergreen conversation about the 1787 Constitution, what they did, what they didn't do, what they could see, what they couldn't see. These are big issues that congressmen and states and justices have struggled with. So of course we expect 3 high school students to fix all this for us. Okay, not true, but I thought you covered the waterfront well. I thought you answered the questions. We were throwing hard questions at you. You thought on your feet. I thought it was a nice job.
I thought that you did a nice job in discussing the issues facing the founders at the Constitutional Convention, talking about slavery in the 3/5 clause, although you might have mentioned the 2 other provisions regarding slavery that are in the Constitution. Talking about the agreed terms for the president was good. That was one of the big issues, and as well as whether there should be a single president or several people in the executive. So that's something to note. I like your point that the issue of citizenship was not really addressed specifically in the Constitution. That carries over to the related issue of voting rights, which was also not specifically addressed. And it's interesting to see that there have been a lot of constitutional amendments increasing the rights of voting for a lot of different people. As a judge, I'm not sure I would agree with you that it's the role of the Supreme Court to be responsive to public views. I think the purpose of judges is to follow the law, whether it's the Constitution or statutes, and different judges have different judicial philosophies. But if the courts just followed the public view, then that would be like another form of a legislature, I think. So I guess I have a different perspective from you about that. And then on the issue of the Commerce Clause that I asked you about, I would have liked to have heard a little bit more about the differences among the founders between the views of the North in favor of exports and the view of the South against imports. And so that was something that you might have said. But overall, I think you showed a good understanding of all the issues in the question, and congratulations on your presentation this afternoon.
You're to be commended for what I thought was a very excellent approach to the question, as well as, frankly, landing on your feet with some of the answers. It was kind of nice to hear you make the references to different Federalist papers that I'm used to hearing, but in response to the questions that got thrown at you. So that showed sort of a depth of knowledge. I truly would ask you to think about that. Staggered terms, there may be some reasons for that. Reflecting the changing of times and the will of the people, I too struggle a bit with that, in that I think that's the benefit of having an unelected Supreme Court, is that they don't have to care, frankly, about what I think right now, because they're there and I hear, and who knows, next week when I look to a different TV channel, I may change my mind about things. the law stays the law. So I'd ask you to just think on that one. Want to do a tip of the hat to you with your response to my having brought in, and first off, the Constitution talks about Indians, and you did a good job of saying you do know you should be calling them Native Americans, but it was really, that was kind of, but because that wasn't, this was a very wide open question that asked you which ones you thought should have been addressed. I thought I threw one at you that you didn't bring up. By the way, I think the Dawes Act was in the 1880s, but there were 1800, there was a 1906, there were the 1924, there have been through, the fact that you pulled the name correctly, even though it may not have been when I think you said it was, maybe I'm wrong, says that you knew what the idea, you knew what you were talking about. And so that's, to me, what was important, was you knew what legislation and where the country tried to talk about some issues. So I really enjoyed it. Want to thank you very much for your presentation, and wish you well. Good luck to you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking with you today.
Good.
Good luck to you all.